Ward is 22 years old and 3 months into her career as a flight attendant when she looks out the window and sees trees, not below her, beside her, filling the frame where sky is supposed to be. She screams the last instruction her passengers will ever hear from a crew member: "Grab your ankles!" No one in the cockpit has told her they are about to hit the ground. No one in the cockpit has told her anything. She does not know that both engines are dead, that the windshield is shattered, or that the sunlit Georgia highway rushing toward them is about to become a runway, a graveyard, and a reckoning with everything America believed about mastering the sky. Look at her. Not the wreckage. Not the burning road or the shattered trees or the scorched grocery store you may have seen in photographs. Look at her before all of that. Look at her the way passengers in 1977 would have seen her, parked at a regional gate in the American South, engines quiet, that cobalt blue cheat line running clean from nose to tail. She is a McDonnell Douglas DC-9-31. Registration November 1, 335, uniform. Serial number 47393. 119 feet long, wingtip to wingtip, just over 93 feet, with a maximum takeoff weight of 108,000 pounds. 2 Pratt & Whitney engines mounted at the tail, a T-shaped stabilizer riding above them like a raised hand. She is not glamorous. She is not famous. She is, in every sense that matters, ordinary, and that ordinariness is the first thing you need to understand about this story. The DC-9 was the workhorse of American regional aviation. If you flew a short hop in the 1970s, Huntsville to Atlanta, Memphis to Nashville, any of the quick connections that stitched together the smaller cities of the South, chances are you flew on something that looked exactly like this. She was not the airplane you booked months in advance or dressed up to board. She was the airplane you barely remembered after landing. Dependable, efficient, familiar. The sort of machine people trusted enough to board without a second thought, the way you might step onto an elevator without inspecting the cables. And that is why the story works. The machine that will fall from the sky on April 4th, 1977, is not some exotic prototype, not some aging relic pushed past its limits. She is the airplane next door, the one your neighbour flew last Tuesday, the one you might have been on yourself. Today, no coherent piece of that airplane survives as a relic you can visit. What survives are photographs, NTSB diagrams, the road, the cemetery, and the memory of a town that never asked to become an accident site. In New Hope, Georgia, a small community in Paulding County, northwest of Atlanta, the crash carved itself into the landscape and never fully left. For decades, the event lived in oral history, in local newspaper archives, in the quiet knowledge of families who lost someone on a sunlit Monday afternoon. Then, in 2021, a formal monument was dedicated, with survivors and family members present, fixing the memory in stone where it had already been fixed in grief. That monument is where we will end. But to understand why it exists, to understand how an ordinary airplane on a 25-minute commuter hop became a mass casualty event that killed 72 people and reshaped the way America thinks about thunderstorms, we need to go back to the airplane, back to the system that built her, flew her, and believed it could protect her from the sky. She does not look doomed. She looks like an appliance of daily life. That is exactly the point. We tell the stories of the ships and planes that never made it home, and the people who were on them. If these are the kinds of stories you want to hear, subscribe. We've got more voyages to cover. Now let's get back to it. The DC-9 family existed because airlines wanted a specific thing: more seats and better economics on short routes without jumping to a much larger jet. Douglas Aircraft, later McDonnell Douglas, answered that demand with a design philosophy built around simplicity and regional efficiency. The original DC-910 was a clean, narrow-body twin that could operate from shorter runways and thinner markets. But airlines wanted more. so Douglas stretched her. The Series 30, the variant that concerns us, added fuselage length, paired it with what Boeing's historical records call the high lift wing, and produced the most commercially successful DC-9 variant ever built. She could carry more passengers, operate profitably on routes that larger jets would starve on, and do it all with the kind of turnaround speed that kept accountants happy. She was not designed to cross oceans. She was designed to connect cities quickly, cheaply, and repeatedly, day after day. Think of the DC-9-30 less as an aircraft and more as a bus with wings. That is not an insult. It is the highest compliment her designers could have received. They wanted to build something so reliable, so routine, that passengers stopped thinking about the act of flying altogether. And they succeeded. By the mid-1970s, DC-9s were everywhere. They were the background noise of American aviation, so common they were nearly invisible. Southern Airways leased serial number 47393 on June 29, 1971. By the afternoon of April 4, 1977, that airframe had logged 15,400 5.6 hours of service. Roughly 640 days of continuous flight time, accumulated over nearly 6 years of regional hops across the southeastern United States. She was not new, she was not old. She was mid-career, the aviation equivalent of a reliable sedan with reasonable mileage. Her engines were Pratt & Whitney JT8D series turbojets, the standard power plant for the type, mounted in pods at the base of the tail. They were proven, widely used and well understood under normal conditions. What the NTSB investigation would later expose was not some hidden manufacturing defect lurking in the metal from the day she was built. There was no single fatal flaw stamped into her at the factory. Instead, the disaster revealed a chain of interacting limits that no one had fully reckoned with. Here is what most people miss about this story. The fatal weakness was not simply mechanical, it was epistemic. It lived in the gap between what the system believed it knew about weather and what the weather actually was. The engines could be overwhelmed. Massive quantities of water and hail, ingested at high rates, could choke the compressors, destroy their ability to maintain thrust, and induce severe stalling. Abrupt changes to the thrust levers during such ingestion could make that stalling worse, not better, a counterintuitive trap for any crew fighting to keep engines alive. After the crash, Douglas and Pratt & Whitney revised their guidance. Avoid severe storm systems entirely, and if an encounter cannot be avoided, do not make abrupt thrust changes in extremely heavy precipitation. That guidance did not exist before April 4, 1977. It was written in the aftermath, in the language of lessons learned from the dead. But the engines were only part of the chain. The airborne weather radar fitted to these aircraft gave crews a picture of precipitation ahead, a picture that invited interpretation. A crew could look at that radar scope and see what appeared to be a gap between two areas of heavy return. They could thread the needle. They could find the hole. The radar encouraged a kind of confidence that, in retrospect, was closer to a dare. It showed you enough to make you believe you understood the storm. It did not show you enough to prove that you didn't. We should not invent a purchase price for this airplane. The record does not support one. And honesty about what we don't know is part of the contract with you, the viewer. What we can say is that Southern Airways DC-9s were tools of a growing network, built to keep the South connected, business travellers linking one meeting to the next, military families heading home, ordinary passengers whose names never made any list until the day their flight didn't land where it was supposed to. That is the emotional architecture of this section. You are not boarding a flying palace. You are boarding a familiar commuter jet, the same kind of airplane thousands of Americans rode every week. And the system around that airplane, dispatch, air traffic control, the National Weather Service, cockpit weather radar, was supposed to combine into a shield against the one thing the airplane could not overpower, the weather overhead. Flight 242 is the story of that shield failing everywhere at once. Let's start in the cockpit, because that is where the decisions will be made, and where the consequences will be felt first. Captain William W. Mackenzie is 54 years old. He has been flying for Southern Airways since October 12, 1960, nearly 17 years by the afternoon of the crash. His total flight time stands at 19,380 hours, including 3,205 in the DC-9. In the language of the profession, Mackenzie is seasoned, not a young hotshot cutting corners, not a burned-out veteran going through the motions. He is the kind of captain passengers never think about because his competence is assumed. You board his airplane expecting nothing to go wrong, and that expectation rests on men exactly like him. Experienced, qualified, familiar with the route, familiar with the aircraft, familiar with the weather patterns of the southeastern United States in spring. Hold that thought. His experience is real. So is the fact that it will not save this flight. In the right seat is First Officer Lyman Keel, 34 years old. He joined Southern on February 12, 1973, and has 3,878 total flight hours, with 235 in the DC-9. Keel is the younger man, the developing professional. In the cockpit voice recorder transcript that will become one of this story's most devastating documents. His voice is the one you hear searching, scanning the radar, trying to read the storm, looking for the path through. "There's a hole," he will say. And later, when there are no more holes and no more engines and no more options, "Bill, you've got to find me a highway." Behind them in the cabin, 2 flight attendants are responsible for 81 passengers. Flight attendant Anne M. Lemoyne has been with Southern since May 15, 1972. The other, identified in the NTSB report as Ward, is 22 years old, hired on January 2, 1977, barely 3 months before the crash. Ward is qualified on both the DC-9 and the Martin 404 with about 2,750 flight hours. She is new, she is young, and when the system collapses, she will do some of the best work anyone does that day. That is one of the most important things this film will show you. The people with the least authority in the system performed with the greatest clarity when the system fell apart. Once both flight attendants became certain that the engines were inoperative, they acted independently, without instruction from the cockpit, without information about what had happened or where they were going. They briefed passengers for an emergency crash landing. They demonstrated exits. They explained the brace position. They told people to stow loose items, remove sharp objects, take off their shoes. They kept working in conditions of almost total ignorance. The cockpit never told them what was happening. The forward attendant opened the cockpit door once, long enough to report that passengers were prepared, and saw the shattered windshield. Then she was sent back to her station. Now, look past the crew, into the cabin. 81 passengers. We do not have full biographies for most of them. The public record is strongest on crew, official findings, and a handful of witnesses. But the NTSB appendix preserves one voice worth following. A commercially licensed pilot seated near the left engine intake, travelling as a passenger. He recalled the flight being entirely routine until severe turbulence hit, accompanied by lightning and hail that grew in size and intensity. He heard engines surging and loud popping sounds. Then both engines quit. We do not have his name confirmed beyond the appendix, so we will use him as a witness voice. Not a character with an invented biography, but a set of ears and eyes we can trust, because he knew enough about flying to understand what was happening to the airplane around him. And then there are the people who were not on the airplane at all. This is what separates Flight 242 from most aviation disasters. The crash did not end at the fuselage. It spilled into a town. In New Hope, Georgia, a young mother named Sadie Burkhalter Hurst was at home when the airplane tore through her community. She watched burned survivors run toward her house, which became an improvised refuge, a place where the abstract word survivor turned back into flesh and voice and need. Her home was not an emergency facility. It was a house. But when an airplane crashes into your front yard, your house becomes whatever the moment demands. On the ground that afternoon, Burley May Bell Creighton, 71 years old, would be killed, not aboard the aircraft, but caught in the violence of its passage through the community. And at Newman's Grocery, a car carrying 7 members of a single family, the Griffins and Gamels, would be destroyed. 7 people from one family dead at a grocery store on a Monday afternoon because a crippled airplane fell out of the sky and into their lives. Flight 242 is not just an aviation disaster. It is a disaster that reached down from the clouds and touched the ground with killing force. The people aboard did not choose to enter that storm. The people below did not even know it was coming. To understand what happened on April 4th, 1977, you need to understand what America believed about flying in the late 1970s, and how much of that belief was faith dressed up as fact. By 1977, commercial aviation had won. The jet age was not new anymore, it was normal. Regional carriers like Southern Airways connected smaller cities to larger hubs across the South, and the experience of flying had lost most of its glamour precisely because it had become so routine. You drove to the airport. You boarded a DC-9. You sat down. 25 minutes later, you were somewhere else. The speed, the convenience, the sheer modernity of it had become background noise. People trusted it. They trusted the airplanes. They trusted the pilots, and they trusted, in a general and largely unexamined way, that the system had figured out weather. That trust was not irrational. It was built on real things. Weather radar existed, both on the ground and in the cockpit. Federal regulations already required airborne weather radar on commercial operations like Flight 242. Dispatchers had access to weather products. Air traffic controllers could see precipitation on their radar scopes. Severe weather watches and warnings were issued by the National Weather Service. Tornado watches, SIGMETs, convective outlooks, the language of atmospheric danger was well developed by 1977. The system looked modern. The system looked complete. It was not. What the NTSB investigation revealed was a patchwork reality hiding behind that modern facade. Southern Airways dispatch setup was not reliably receiving some severe weather material that afternoon. The FAA's controller displays did not give crews a full intensity picture of what was ahead. The shared language for describing thunderstorm severity, the vocabulary controllers and pilots used to talk about what they were seeing, was not yet operationally standardized in the way later safety thinking would demand. Everyone had a piece of the picture. No one had the whole picture, and each actor in the system assumed that somebody else's piece completed the map. It didn't. This is the deeper architecture of the disaster, and it is worth sitting with for a moment. The problem was not that the system lacked tools. The problem was that the tools encouraged overconfidence. A pilot could look at his airborne radar and see a gap in the returns and believe he was seeing a gap in the storm. A controller could report heavy precipitation on the scope and believe that report constituted adequate warning. A dispatcher could review the weather products available and believe the crew had what they needed. Each link in the chain was doing something. None of them were doing enough, and the gaps between their separate understandings were invisible until an airplane flew into one. Southern's own operations manual contemplated delaying or deviating to avoid thunderstorms. The NTSB later concluded that on this day, both dispatch and crew placed significant reliance on the aircraft's radar and on personal knowledge of route conditions. Surface truth, the system had weather tools. Deeper truth, the tools were partial, and partiality bred false confidence. Hidden significance, when the information stream is incomplete, each participant fills the gap with assumption. And assumption, in a thunderstorm, can kill. That is the world Flight 242 departed into. A world that believed it had mastered the sky enough to navigate its worst moods. A world about to be taught otherwise. The flight is simple. Muscle Shoals, Alabama to Atlanta, Georgia, with one stop at Huntsville. A route so short that the en route estimate from Huntsville to Atlanta is 25 minutes. This is not a transatlantic crossing. This is not a polar route over featureless ice. This is a commute, the kind of flight where passengers read half an article, glance out the window and start gathering their bags. Flight 242 departs Muscle Shoals at 3:21 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. She lands at Huntsville around 3:44 p.m., picks up passengers, and departs again at approximately 3:54 p.m. on an instrument flight plan. 81 passengers, 4 crew. Requested cruising altitude, 17,000 feet. Route, direct to the Rome Vivo R, then a profile descent into Atlanta. 25 minutes. That is all this flight is supposed to last. The disaster will arrive before the viewer has settled into the idea of a journey. The catastrophe belongs to the compression of time. Before departure, Captain Mackenzie has been given tornado watches, SIGMETs, and 1,400 weather reports for selected terminals along the route. He knows there is weather out there. The question that will haunt this story is how bad, how organised, and how avoidable. The answer is worsening by the minute, and he is not getting the updates. While Flight 242 sits at Huntsville, the picture ahead is deteriorating fast. The Rome, Georgia, observer has had a tornado watch in effect since around 1400. Continuous thunder is reported by about 3:30 p.m. After that, a tornado warning is issued for the Rome area, as forecasters observe intense radar echoes, including hook echoes, the signature of rotating storms, cruise good skies, west of the city. This is not a garden variety spring shower. This is one of the most severe convective systems in the United States during the preceding 3 years, as the NTSB will later characterize it. And Southern Airways Dispatch does not provide the flight crew with up-to-date severe weather information pertaining to the intended route. Hold that sentence. Read it again. The airline's own dispatch system fails to pass along current severe weather data for the route the airplane is about to fly. That is not turbulence. That is not an act of God. That is an act of institutional negligence. And it is one of the contributing causes the NTSB will name when the investigation is finished. The flight departs Huntsville into a sky that is already angry. About the same time they leave, thunderstorms with moderate rain showers are being reported at Huntsville itself, and departure control issues weather advisories. The crew is receiving information. The information is real, but it is insufficiently granular. Broad strokes when what they need is fine detail. They know there is weather. They do not know, in operationally useful terms, how bad the weather is, how tightly organised, or where the worst of it sits relative to their route. Now listen to the cockpit voice recorder. At about 3:55 p.m, Captain Mackenzie says, "Well, the radar is full of it, take your pick." Air traffic control advises that the radar scope shows heavy precipitation 5 miles ahead. First Officer Keel studies his display, struggling to interpret what he sees. "I can't read that," he says. "It just looks like rain." And then comes the line that will define the flight's fate. "There's a hole." A few exchanges later, Mackenzie says going straight looks like the best way through. The logic is calm. The voices are professional. 2 experienced men are looking at a radar picture and reading it the way they have been trained to read it. finding the path of least resistance, threading the gap, pushing through a storm they believe is navigable because their instruments suggest it is. They are professional, they are calm, and they are wrong. The storm ahead is not a curtain with a convenient gap. It is a complex, multi-celled, convective monster. And the hole they think they see is a radar artifact, a gap in the depiction, not a gap in the storm. They are flying toward a core of extraordinary violence, and nothing in the information stream is telling them so with sufficient clarity or urgency. The tunnel narrows, radar returns fill the scope. Partial controller advisories confirm weather, but not intensity. A short route leaves no time for second thoughts. A crew who believe a gap exists commit to a heading, and a storm whose true structure no one in the system fully grasps waits directly ahead. 25 minutes. That was all this flight was supposed to last. They will never make Atlanta. It is approximately 4:04 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Flight 242 is between 17,000 and 14,000 feet, somewhere near Rome, Georgia, descending toward Atlanta. And then the sound begins on the cockpit voice recorder. Heavy, violent, unmistakable. Hail. Rain. Not the kind that drums on a windshield during a summer drive. The kind that sounds like gravel thrown against metal at 200 miles an hour. The airplane has entered the storm. What happens next does not arrive as a single catastrophic blow. It arrives in layers, each one stripping away another margin of survival. The turbulence is severe. Passengers are thrown against their seatbelts. Lightning flashes on the left side of the aircraft, close enough to feel electric. The hail increases, not just in volume, but in size. Stones growing as the airplane pushes deeper into the convective core. The passenger seated near the left engine intake, the commercially licensed pilot travelling in the cabin, hears engine surging and loud popping sounds. He knows what those sounds mean. Most passengers do not, but they can feel it. A wrongness in the vibration, a roughness in the ride that goes beyond turbulence into something mechanical and terrifying. The hail and water are entering the engines now, massive quantities. The Pratt & Whitney JT-8Ds are ingesting precipitation at rates they were never designed to handle. Inside each engine, the compressor, the spinning assembly of blades and vanes that squeezes air before it meets fuel and ignites, is being battered. Hailstones are striking the blades. Water is flooding the combustion process. Think of it this way. Imagine trying to keep a bonfire burning while someone aims a fire hose directly into the flames and throws rocks at the logs. The engines are not simply quitting. They are being overwhelmed, choked, and physically damaged blade by blade, stage by stage. At about 4:04, electrical power is interrupted for 36 seconds. Engine speed has fallen below the threshold needed to drive the generators. For more than half a minute, the cockpit goes dark, or nearly so. The crew is flying inside a violent storm, their instruments flickering, their engines failing, their radar useless inside the cell they have entered. When power returns, the picture is not better, it is worse. At approximately 4:09 p.m., Flight 242 radios a transmission that tells the story in fragments. The windshield is busted and the left engine has cut out. The windshield. Think about that. The storm has physically shattered the cockpit glass. Hailstones, some of them substantial, have cracked the windshield to the point where the pilot's view of the outside world, already obscured by rain and cloud, is now fractured by a web of broken transparency. The storm is no longer outside the airplane. It has broken the airplane's face. Minutes later, the right engine begins to fail. The same process, water, hail, compressor damage, stalling, is devouring the second power plant. The crew is watching their options collapse in real time. One engine gone, then the other faltering. Altitude bleeding away. Airspeed eroding. The DC-9, which weighs tens of thousands of pounds, is becoming a glider, and not a good one. Without thrust, she descends at a rate that turns miles into minutes and minutes into seconds. By approximately 4:13 p.m., the crew makes the call that changes everything. They tell Atlanta Approach Control that they have lost both engines. Both. The airplane is powerless, and they ask for a vector to the nearest place they can land. Dobbins Air Force Base is offered. It is roughly 20 miles away. The crew accepts, but immediately begins asking the questions that reveal what they already suspect. How far exactly? What is the weather there? What is the runway heading? How long is the runway? Is there anything closer? Those are not the questions of men who believe they can make it. Those are the questions of men outrunning glide math, calculating in their heads whether the altitude they have left can be converted into enough distance to reach a runway. Any runway. Every second, the airplane descends. Every second, the geometry gets worse. At about 4:16, they are told Cartersville is closer. But even Cartersville may be out of reach. Mackenzie says he is picking out a clear field. The DC-9 is below the clouds now, the terrain of northwest Georgia, visible beneath them. Roads, trees, houses, a landscape that was never meant to receive a dying jetliner. And then Keel says it. The line that belongs in every trailer, every documentary, every retelling of this disaster. Bill, you've got to find me a highway. In the cabin, the story is running on a parallel track of courage and blindness. At 4:07, shortly after the airplane enters the worst of the hail and rain, the aft flight attendant tells passengers to keep their seatbelts fastened. That is standard. What follows is not. Once both attendants are certain the engines are out, and they determine this on their own without confirmation from the cockpit, they begin a full emergency crash landing briefing. Exits, brace position, stow your luggage, remove sharp objects from your pockets, take off your shoes, prepare for evacuation. They are doing textbook emergency work. The kind of work that training is supposed to prepare you for, but that nothing truly prepares you for when the airplane is falling and no one has told you where or when it will stop. The forward attendant opens the cockpit door one time. She sees the shattered windshield. She reports that passengers are prepared. She is sent back to the cabin. That is the last communication between the cockpit and the cabin crew before impact. The aft flight attendant, Ward, 22 years old, 3 months on the job, looks out a window. She sees trees. They are close. They are filling the frame. She screams the last instruction her passengers will hear from a crew member. "Grab your ankles!" There is no signal from the flight deck that landing is imminent. The cabin crew does not know they are about to hit the ground. They just see trees where sky is supposed to be. At 4:18:02 p.m., the crew's final transmission is recorded. "We're putting it on the highway. We're down to nothing." The airplane is aimed at State Spur Highway 92. Below, New Hope, Georgia, is sunlit. The storm that killed the engines is overhead and to the west. The town that will receive the dying aircraft is under a clear sky. People are outside, cars are moving, a grocery store is open, a gas station is pumping fuel. They do not know what is coming. They have perhaps 10 seconds to live their lives before a commercial jetliner, powerless and descending, enters their world at highway level. The outboard left wing strikes trees south-southwest of New Hope first. Then both wings hit more trees and utility poles on either side of the highway. 570 feet after the first tree strike, the left main landing gear contacts the road surface. The airplane is on the highway, but not landing. She is ploughing. Almost simultaneously, the left wing structure strikes an embankment. The airplane veers left, leaves the highway, and travels another 1,260 feet before coming to rest. Along that path, she destroys signs, utility poles, fences, shrubs, gasoline pumps, 5 automobiles, and a truck. The total wreckage field stretches approximately 1,900 feet long and 295 feet wide. nearly a third of a mile of destruction through the centre of a community. Flight 242 does not land. She carves. And in the wreckage that is now scattered across New Hope, in the burning fuselage, the shattered road, the demolished gas station, the crushed cars, 85 people aboard and an unknown number on the ground are about to discover whether they will live or die. The airplane has stopped moving. The dying has only begun. The wreckage of Flight 242 is not resting in a field miles from civilization. It is lying in the middle of a town. Parts of it are on the highway. Parts of it are in a yard. Parts of it are burning against the side of a grocery store and gas station where, moments ago, people were buying milk and filling their tanks. The distinction matters. In most aviation disasters, the crash site is a destination. Rescuers travel to it. In New Hope, Georgia, the crash site is the neighborhood. The rescuers are the neighbors. The forward section of the fuselage has been largely demolished. The NTSB's survivability analysis will later conclude that survival in the front of the cabin was often fortuitous rather than designed, meaning that if you lived through the forward impact, it was closer to luck than engineering. The structure broke apart in ways that crushed some seats and spared others with no pattern that post-crash analysis could attribute to intentional protection. The aft section fared somewhat better structurally, though fire would ravage it within minutes. Fire. That is the second killer, arriving immediately after impact. Ruptured fuel lines, shorted electrical systems, and, crucially, the gasoline pumps at the roadside station all feed the flames. The fire is not confined to the airplane. It spreads to the gas station, to the grocery store, to vehicles on the road. Downed power lines, severed by the wings, as the airplane carved through the community, snake across the ground, adding electrocution to the catalogue of hazards. The wreckage field is not just a crash site. It is a burning, electrified, fuel-soaked debris corridor, nearly a third of a mile long. Inside what remains of the cabin, passengers who survived the impact face an immediate decision that most have no capacity to make rationally. Get out or die where you sit. Some are pinned, some are unconscious, some are uninjured but disoriented, unable to tell up from down in a fuselage that has deformed around them. Smoke fills the interior with terrifying speed. The fire is consuming the cabin materials, seats, carpet, insulation, overhead panels, and producing toxic fumes that will kill as efficiently as the flames themselves. The flight attendants are alive, both of them, and both of them go to work. The forward attendant, Anne Lemoyne, finds herself hanging upside down in her jump seat after impact, still strapped in. She releases her seatbelt, drops, and tries to open the main cabin door. It will not move. The fuselage has deformed around it, jamming the frame. She cannot get passengers out through the primary exit, so she finds an opening in the broken fuselage, a tear in the skin of the airplane, and crawls through it. Once outside, she does not stop. She does not sit down. She runs to a nearby house to summon help. She is injured. She goes anyway. The aft attendant, Ward, 22 years old, 3 months into her career, the youngest crew member aboard, faces flames and jammed exits in the rear of the aircraft. The overwing exits, the aft service door, the options that training told her would be there, compromised, blocked, or surrounded by fire. She escapes through broken fuselage structure, the same way Lemoyne did, not through a door, but through a wound in the airplane's body. Both women survive. Both women act. And what they did in the minutes before impact, the independent emergency briefing, the brace commands, the exit demonstrations performed without a single word of explanation from the cockpit, almost certainly saved lives. The passengers who knew to brace, who knew where the exits were, who had removed sharp objects from their pockets and shoes from their feet, had those advantages because 2 flight attendants decided that not knowing what was happening was not a reason to stop doing their jobs. There is an uncomfortable footnote here, and honesty demands we include it. The NTSB, noted that the standard procedure directing passengers to remove their shoes, a protocol designed to protect evacuation slides from puncture by heels and hard soles, left some survivors with unprotected feet as they fled through wreckage, fire, broken metal and shattered glass. They suffered cuts and burns that the shoes might have prevented. It is a small detail that captures the larger theme of this entire disaster. Systems optimized for the normal emergency can fail catastrophically in the abnormal one. The rule made sense for an orderly slide evacuation at an airport gate. It made no sense for a barefoot escape through a burning roadside debris field. Outside the airplane, New Hope is experiencing something no community prepares for. Sadie Burkhalter Hurst watches from her home as burned survivors, human beings on fire or bearing the marks of fire, run across her yard. Her house becomes a triage point, a shelter, a place where people who moments ago were seated in an airplane cabin now stumble through a screen door seeking water, help, and the simple fact of a roof. The scene is not cinematic chaos. It is intimate, domestic horror. A young mother in her own yard watching people die and helping people live in the same 10-minute span. On the road, the destruction is total. The 5 automobiles and the truck destroyed by the airplane's passage are not abstract statistics. They are vehicles with people inside them. At Newman's Grocery, the car carrying 7 members of the Griffin and Gamble families has been caught in the wreckage path. 7 people from one family. At a grocery store on a Monday. There is no version of this story that softens that fact, and we will not attempt one. Burley May Bell Creighton, 71 years old, is killed on the ground. Not a passenger, not a crew member, simply a person who was in New Hope, Georgia, at 4:18 p.m. on April 4th, 1977. Her death reminds us of something easy to forget in aviation disaster narratives. The airplane does not care where it lands. The people beneath it have no warning, no brace position, no flight attendant telling them what to do. They are simply there, and then they are not. The weather at New Hope itself, and this detail is almost unbearable in its irony, is clear. The sun is shining. The storm that destroyed the airplane's engines is overhead and to the west. A massive convective system that dumped its violence on the flight at altitude, and then let the crippled jet fall through the bottom of the cloud deck into a sunlit afternoon. The townspeople who look up and see an airplane materializing above the trees are not standing in rain, they are standing in daylight. The disaster arrives from a beautiful sky. Rescue begins almost before the airplane stops moving. Volunteer firefighters from a nearby New Hope station witness the crash. They see it happen and respond with 2 fire trucks. One is dispatched to the combination grocery store and gas station fire, which is being fed by gasoline from the damaged pumps and likely ignited by shorted power lines. The other attacks fires burning in the mid and aft sections of the aircraft, where survivors may still be trapped. These are volunteer firefighters. They are not a major metropolitan department with specialized aircraft rescue training and foam tenders standing by. They are local men with local equipment who just watched a commercial jetliner plow through their community, and they are driving toward it. Cobb County firefighters arrive at approximately 4:46 p.m., roughly 28 minutes after impact. Volunteers from Hiram and Union assist. The fires are extinguished in about 30 minutes. That half hour between the crash and the last flames is where the boundary between the living and the dead is drawn for many of the injured. Those who can be pulled from the wreckage before the fire reaches them survive. Those who cannot, do not. The medical response comes in layers, each one slightly more organized than the last, but none of them adequate to the scale of what has happened. 5 hospitals are notified, the first at about 4:20 p.m., 2 minutes after impact, and the last by approximately 6:10 p.m. The first survivor reaches Memorial Hospital in Dallas, Georgia at about 4:30 p.m. 12 minutes after the crash, an FAA designated medical examiner and a nurse arrive on scene around 4:34 p.m. and become the first medically qualified personnel at the wreckage site. They begin triage and coordinate transport. Think about what that means. For the first 16 minutes after a commercial jet crashes into a town, the medical response consists of whoever is already there: neighbours, volunteer firefighters, the flight attendants themselves. Local homes become shelters. Volunteer departments become frontline trauma units. Regional hospitals activate emergency plans in cascade, each one learning about the disaster minutes after the last. This is rural disaster medicine in 1977. It is brave, improvised, and overwhelmed. Now the counting begins, and counting is the part of every disaster story that reduces human beings to arithmetic. So let us do it carefully. 85 people were aboard Flight 242, 81 passengers and 4 crew members. Of those 85, 62 died at the scene or in the immediate aftermath. 22 were seriously injured. 1 was slightly injured. One passenger who survived the crash died later on June 5, 1977, 2 months after impact. On the ground, 8 people were killed. One ground victim who was seriously injured died approximately a month later. Here is where the numbers require an honest explanation. The NTSB's original report used a 70 fatality framework because the reporting rule in effect at the time counted only deaths occurring within 7 days of the accident. 2 victims, one aboard and one on the ground, died after that window closed. The widely cited historical total, and the number this film will use, is 72 dead. We mentioned the discrepancy once here, so you understand it. The NTSB was not undercounting. It was following a rule. The rule has since changed. The dead have not. 72 people, 22 survivors from the airplane, an entire town scarred. Let us account for the people we have followed. Captain William Mackenzie, 54 years old, 19,380 flight hours, dies in the crash. The man whose experience was supposed to be the last line of defence does not survive the failure of every line before it. First Officer Lyman Keel, 34 years old, the man who said, "Find me a highway," dies of his injuries later that day. He lived long enough to know they had made the road. He did not live long enough to know whether anyone else had survived. Both flight attendants, Lemoyne and Ward, survive. The women who did the best work in the worst conditions walk out of the wreckage. That is not poetic justice. It is not a reward for heroism. It is the blind geometry of a crash that killed people in one row and spared them in the next. But it allows the film this much. The people who fought hardest for the passengers' survival are alive to bear witness. On the ground, the Griffin and Gamble family members, 7 of them, are dead at Newman's Grocery. Burley May Bell Creighton, 71, is dead. The community that woke up that Monday morning as a quiet crossroads northwest of Atlanta goes to sleep, those who can sleep, as the site of the worst aviation disaster in Georgia's history. And Sadie Burkhalter Hurst's house, the one where burned survivors ran through the yard, still stands in the landscape of local memory. She did not choose to become part of this story. The story chose her, the way a falling airplane chooses its ground, without consultation, without mercy, without warning. The investigation begins immediately, but the formal reckoning takes months. The NTSB adopts its aircraft accident report on January 26, 1978, following a public hearing held in Atlanta from June 6 through June 10, 1977, barely 2 months after the crash. The parties to that hearing tell you everything about the scope of the failure, the FAA, Southern Airways, the Airline Pilots Association, the Professional Air Traffic Controllers Organization, the National Weather Service, the Transport Workers Union, Pratt and Whitney, Douglas Aircraft Company, and the Aviation Consumer Action Project. Read that list again. The manufacturer of the engines, the manufacturer of the airframe, the airline, the pilots union, the controllers union, the weather service, the regulator, a consumer advocacy group. This is not a narrow inquiry into whether one pilot made one bad turn. This is a reckoning with an entire system, every institution that touched this flight, from the factory floor to the forecast office, to the control tower, to the cockpit. The NTSB's probable cause finding is precise, and its precision is what makes it devastating. The board determined that the probable cause of the accident was the total loss of thrust in both engines while the aircraft was penetrating an area of severe thunderstorms. That loss of thrust was caused by the ingestion of massive amounts of water and hail, which, in combination with thrust lever movement by the crew, induced severe stalling in the engine compressors and inflicted major physical damage on them. There it is. The engines were destroyed by the storm they entered. The crew's own attempts to manage thrust, the instinctive, trained response of pilots fighting to keep engines alive, actually worsened the compressor stalls. The airplane was killed by the weather and then killed again by the interaction between weather and the crew's response to it. That is not pilot error in the simple accusatory sense. That is a trap. A set of conditions where doing what training and instinct told you to do made the outcome worse. But the board did not stop at the cockpit. The contributing factors are where institutional accountability enters the story, and they should be read with the weight they deserve. First, the failure of the Southern Airways dispatch system to provide the flight crew with up-to-date severe weather information pertaining to the route of the flight. The airline's own dispatch operation did not get current weather to the crew. That is not weather being unpredictable. That is an organization failing to move information it had, or should have had, to the people who needed it. Second, the captain's reliance on airborne weather radar for penetration of the thunderstorm area. Mackenzie trusted his radar to show him a path through the storm. The radar showed him something that looked like a path. It was not. The board is not saying Mackenzie was reckless. It is saying he placed faith in a tool whose limitations were not adequately understood by him, by the airline, by the industry. Third, the limitations in the FAA's air traffic control system, which precluded the timely dissemination of hazardous weather information to the flight. The controllers could see weather on their scopes. They could not see it with the intensity discrimination needed to tell a crew in operationally precise terms that what lay ahead was not navigable. The technology existed to detect precipitation. The technology did not exist or was not deployed to communicate its severity in a way that would have changed the outcome. 3 contributing factors, 3 institutions. Dispatch failed. The radar picture was incomplete. The ATC weather display system was inadequate. The crew flew into a gap between what the system depicted and what the storm actually was, and 72 people died in that gap. The investigation also produced findings about the storm itself that reframed the central question of the disaster. Evidence showed that the flight entered a relatively small but extraordinarily intense area of precipitation embedded within a larger, more complex storm structure. The board believed that had this intense core been identified adequately and communicated in real time to both pilot and controller, the flight path might have been different. That is a careful, measured statement, and its care is its power. The NTSB is not saying the crew could have easily avoided the storm. It is saying the system never gave them the information that would have made avoidance possible. This is the distinction that matters ethically and dramatically. The fatal path was not chosen with full knowledge of what lay ahead. It was chosen in the gap between storm reality and storm depiction. Mackenzie and Keel did not fly into a thunderstorm they knew would kill them. They flew into a thunderstorm they believed they could navigate because every source of information available to them, radar, dispatch, ATC, either confirmed that belief or failed to contradict it. Do not turn them into villains. They were wrong, and their wrongness cost lives, including their own. But they were wrong inside a system that was also wrong, and that system survived while they did not. The cabin safety findings deserve attention too, because they capture the story's larger theme in miniature. The NTSB praised the flight attendants' initiative, their independent decision to brief passengers for a crash landing, their courage in conditions of near-total ignorance. But the report also documented the consequences of the shoe removal protocol. Survivors fleeing through wreckage and fire with unprotected feet, suffering injuries that footwear would have prevented. A rule designed for one kind of emergency made a different kind of emergency worse. That is Flight 242, in a single detail. Every part of the system was optimized for a scenario that was not the scenario that occurred. We should be clear about what the public record does and does not contain regarding legal aftermath. The strongest, most thoroughly documented story is the NTSB and FAA reckoning, the official findings, the manufacturer guidance changes, the operational recommendations. We will not manufacture a dramatic prosecution arc that the verified record does not support. What the record supports is severe institutional judgment. Southern's dispatch failed. The FAA's weather display system failed. The industry's understanding of engine behavior in severe precipitation was incomplete. And a crew entered a storm that an adequate information system might have steered them around. The judgment of history is not ambiguous. Everyone involved had a piece of the responsibility. No one had enough of the picture to prevent the disaster. And 72 people paid for the collective failure with their lives. Here is where most retellings of this story get it wrong. And getting it right matters, both to the dead and to the truth. The popular version says something like, after Flight 242, weather radar was required in all commercial aircraft. That sounds clean. It sounds satisfying. It is also misleading. Airborne weather radar was already required by federal regulation for operations like Flight 242. The basic mandate existed. What did not exist, and what this disaster forced into being, was a fundamentally different philosophy about how weather information should be depicted, communicated, and shared across the system. In September 1977, 5 months after the crash, the NTSB issued recommendations urging the FAA to expedite the development of a weather subsystem for en route and terminal radar environments. The board wanted a system capable of displaying precipitation or turbulence in real time, with multiple intensity classifications, not just weather ahead, but weather ahead. And here is how severe it is on a standardized scale that means the same thing to the pilot, the controller, and the dispatcher. In that same recommendation set, the NTSB called for a standard thunderstorm intensity language based on the National Weather Service's 6-level classification scheme. And it called for indoctrination, training, of both pilots and controllers in that shared vocabulary. That word, indoctrination, is bureaucratic, but its meaning is revolutionary. The board was saying that the people sharing the sky were not describing the same storm in the same way, and that linguistic failure was killing people. This is a much more powerful legacy than they added radar. What Flight 242 forced was a reckoning with the quality of the weather picture, not just its existence. The system had tools. The tools produced partial, ambiguous, differently interpreted information. The fix was not more tools. It was better tools, common language, and shared understanding. The legacy continued. In 1980, citing the Southern Airways crash by name, the NTSB pushed for faster deployment of National Weather Service weather radar color remote displays to air route traffic control centers. The board also recommended mapping techniques that would allow controllers to correlate weather images with aircraft positions on their radar displays. The argument was explicit. Had such systems been available before disasters like Southern 242, the likelihood of their occurrence could have been greatly diminished. Color display mattered because it translated raw radar return data into visual urgency. Red for severe, yellow for moderate, green for light. A controller looking at a green and red map processes intensity information faster and more accurately than a controller reading a monochrome scope and estimating severity by echo shape. That transition from monochrome guesswork to color-coded clarity owes a direct debt to the 72 people who died in New Hope. There is also a smaller but precisely drawn legacy in aircraft-specific procedure. In November 1977, 7 months after the crash, Douglas Aircraft, with Pratt and Whitney's concurrence, cancelled its earlier guidance on engine operation in severe weather and replaced it with a new recommendation. Avoid severe storm systems entirely. And if avoidance is impossible, do not make abrupt thrust changes in extremely heavy precipitation. That sentence rewrites the contract between crew and engine. Before Flight 242, the implicit understanding was that a skilled crew could manage engine performance through a storm. After Flight 242, the manufacturer itself said, "Do not enter the storm. And if you do not do the thing your instincts tell you to do with the throttles. The cause and effect chain is complete." The storm entered the engines. Thrust manipulation worsened the compressor stalls. The accident exposed the danger. The guidance changed. The deaths produced a specific, traceable procedural reform that every crew flying a JT-8D-powered aircraft after November 1977 inherited. That is accountability in its most concrete form, not a prison sentence, but a rewritten manual that says, in the language of engineering, "We were wrong, and here is what we learned." Do not leave this section believing that a single rule fixed everything. What Flight 242 produced was not a silver bullet. It was a cascade of improvements: better weather depiction, common severity language, color-coded ATC displays, revised engine management procedures, stronger emphasis on storm avoidance over storm penetration. No one of those changes would have been sufficient alone. Together, they rebuilt the weather awareness architecture of American aviation. And they did it because 72 people fell through the gap in the old one. The road has changed names. The wreckage is gone. The grocery store, the gas station, the utility poles sheared off by the wings, all replaced, rebuilt, or absorbed back into the ordinary landscape of a small Georgia community. If you drive through New Hope today, nothing in the road itself tells you that a commercial jetliner once used it as a runway. Traffic moves. People live their lives. The trees have grown back, but the memory has not faded. It has, if anything, hardened, fixed in local consciousness, with a force that surprises people who expect small-town disasters to blur with time. Flight 242 fused an aviation tragedy with a community trauma in a way that made forgetting impossible. The airplane did not crash in a remote field. It crashed through yards, stores, cars, and lives. The dead included passengers and neighbours. The survivors included flight attendants and the woman who opened her front door to burned strangers. The event belongs to aviation history, but it also belongs to the town, and the town has not let it go. Survivors and families kept the memory active through reunions, annual observances, and a culture of remembrance that existed informally for decades before it was made permanent. In 2021, 44 years after the crash, a formal monument was dedicated in New Hope, with survivors and family members present. The ceremony was not a media spectacle. It was a community act, the kind of gathering where people who were children in 1977 stand beside people who lost parents, spouses, and siblings, and together they say the names of the dead out loud. That act of naming is the story's final, irreducible gesture. You can change the regulations. You can improve the radar displays. You can rewrite the engine manuals and standardize the weather vocabulary and deploy color-coded systems in every control center in the country. All of that matters. All of that saves lives. But none of it brings back the 72. The names remain. The absence remains. The monument stands not as a celebration of lessons learned, but as an acknowledgement that those lessons were purchased at a price that can never be repaid. Come back to the road. It is daylight. It is quiet. Traffic moves through New Hope, the way traffic moves through any small community in the Georgia Piedmont. Unhurried, unremarkable, ordinary. The trees that line the roadside have had nearly 50 years to grow. The sky above is the same sky that was clear and blue on April 4th, 1977, when a town looked up and saw an airplane where no airplane was supposed to be. Flight 242 is a story about the distance between confidence and knowledge, a modern jet, a veteran captain, a regulated airline, a weather-aware air traffic system, a nation that believed it had learned to manage the sky. All of it came up against a thunderstorm that exceeded the picture every one of them had of it. And the gap between that picture and reality was measured not in radar returns or forecast models, but in human lives. Yet the story does not end in the storm. It ends with two young flight attendants who did their jobs in the dark. With volunteer firefighters who drove toward a burning wreckage field, because that is what you do. With a woman who opened her door to strangers who were on fire. With investigators who named institutional failures when it would have been easier to blame the dead crew. With engineers who rewrote the manuals. With a safety board that demanded a common language for danger so that the people sharing the sky would finally be describing the same storm. And it ends here, on this road, in this quiet, where traffic passes over the ground that was, for a few terrible seconds on a Monday afternoon, a runway, a graveyard, and the place where American aviation was forced to admit how little it still knew about the storms it claimed it could navigate. The storm swallowed the airplane. It did not swallow the lessons, but it should never have taken 72 lives to learn them.